Hi, Maria from Dignified Minds. In this video, I would like to share with you my overriding strategy or approach that I use with every single person that I meet living with dementia. That approach being accepting the person living with dementia's world, accepting their reality, their logic, their time and space, putting aside the now, if they're not in the now, meeting them where they're at. So the book Contented Dementia by Oliver James was really helpful in making me see that people living with dementia, if they're not in the here and now because they have short-term memory loss, then they may be back in time. And when they're confronted with a situation, like for example my dad, went through a period of thinking that he hadn't taken his pills because he'd forgotten that he'd taken them that day or that morning. So his brain back in the past, because he can't remember this morning, he fills in the gaps, because that's what our brain does. It fills in the gaps and it comes up with an explanation as to why that is. And so he would say, well, I haven't taken my pills because they're not here and you haven't been, all of which wasn't correct. And I, at that point in time, didn't know any different. So I would say, no, but Dad, you did take your pills and I was here this morning, and his space and time was here, my space and time was in the now, and they didn't meet. So we ended up like this. Stress, arguing, I felt resentful, and the list goes on. And then I learnt from Jane Verity, who's the founder of Spark of Life, which is a model of care, that people living with dementia still feel. They know exactly how you and I make them feel. And so in that moment when I was arguing with Dad and giving him my logic, how was he feeling? Well, it was obvious because we were arguing. He would end up sometimes yelling at me, and he never did that normally. And then I thought about it, if that was me and I was adamant that I hadn't taken my pills, and someone comes in and says, well, Maria, you actually have, that's not helpful. How do we feel when someone tells us the opposite? We don't often like that, do we? So of course we're going to argue, stand up for ourselves. And that was what Dad was doing. So I had to stop and think, wow, so if I would feel like that, well then Dad's obviously feeling like that, and what an awful place to be. So how can I do it differently? So over time, I had to learn how to accept Dad's and Mum's reality, where they were at. And if Dad thought he hadn't had his pills, well then no amount of telling him that he had made any sense to him. So I had actually ended up saying to Dad, you know what, Dad, you haven't had your pills. And in that moment of me validating where he was at, he was just like, oh, so I haven't had my pills. And I'm like, no, Dad, and here comes the loving lie. Loving lies is in another video that I've made. I said, well, Dad, you haven't had your pills because you went to the doctors the other day and you're in such great health for being in your 80s. The doctor said you don't need to take your pills anymore. So isn't that amazing? And Dad was like, oh, wow, so I don't have to take pills. The conversation ended in a very, very different place. And Dad would feel 10 feet tall because he was so good for his age and didn't have to take his pills anymore. The loving lie worked because the next day Dad had forgotten the conversation, so he would take his pills. This particular situation would not work for everyone. You have to find the loving lies that works for your particular person living with dementia. But by accepting Dad's reality, accepting where he was at, accepting his logic and reasoning, made our relationship be in a completely different space. Instead of being two separate places that were doing this, we ended up together. It was an absolute game changer for going forward to being with Mum and Dad, and our relationship actually improved. So that is my overall approach, accepting their world, their logic and their reasoning. And a word of warning, is this going to work for everybody at every given time? Absolutely not. Sometimes it's not going to work, especially if your person is in the earlier stages of dementia and they have more insight. For some people, loving lies aren't going to work, but this is the best place that I recommend you start from. Thank you for watching.